Picture a warehouse in Kollam, on the southwestern coast of India, in the year 1952. The air inside smells of something between roasted grain and acid. A woman sits at a low table, cracking cashew shells with a wooden mallet. She has been doing this for 12 years. Her hands are mapped with pale scars, not from the mallet, from the oil that sprays out of the shell when it cracks. That oil is in the same chemical family as poison ivy. It causes the same blistering rash. In concentrated form, it can burn through skin in seconds. The woman at the table knows this. She has known it since her first week in the factory. There is no treatment on site. There is cold water from a bucket in the corner. She works 11 hours a day. At the end of her shift, she goes home. The next morning, she comes back. This is where the history of the cashew actually starts. Not in a grocery store, not in a cocktail bar. In a warehouse that smelled of acid, at a table where women split shells open so that the nut inside could be extracted without contaminating it with the oil that would make it inedible. The cashew you have eaten in your life was touched by hands like hers. That fact appears nowhere on the packaging. This is the history of the cashew nut. It is also the history of a fruit nobody outside Brazil has tasted, a poison that ends up in automobile brake pads, a colonial policy that failed in predictable ways, and a label, raw cashews, that is fiction. The cashew tree is native to northeastern Brazil, specifically to the semi-arid interior of Ceará, Piauí, and Maranhão. This is not the lush green Amazon that most people picture when they think of Brazil. This is a landscape of dry scrub, rocky soil, and irregular rainfall. The trees that grow here are adapted to hardship. The cashew tree is one of them. Anacardium occidentale, the cashew tree's scientific name, carries its own description. Anacardium comes from the Greek. Ana means upward or outside. Cardia means heart. The nut, which has roughly the shape of a heart, grows on the outside of the fruit, not inside it, outside, hanging from the bottom of a swollen, fleshy structure that looks like a small pear or apple. No other commercially cultivated plant does this. Every other fruit keeps its seed inside, wrapped in flesh. The cashew reverses this. The fleshy part, the cashew apple, is technically not a fruit at all. It is the swollen stem connecting the flower to the branch. The actual botanical fruit is the nut. The thing you eat is the seed of the fruit, and it grows on the outside. This anatomical inversion has consequences. The nut hangs exposed, with nothing between it and every insect, bird, or mammal that might want to eat it. The tree solved this problem chemically. The shell contains Cashew Nut Shell Liquid, CNSL, a dark oil that sits between the outer and inner layers of the shell. CNSL belongs to the same class of compounds as urushiol, which causes poison ivy reactions. Contact with raw cashew shells causes chemical burns, blistering, and severe allergic reactions in some cases. The CNSL is not an accident. It is a defense system. A nut that grows on the outside of its fruit, with no protective flesh around it, needs something to deter the animals that would otherwise eat it before the seed has a chance to germinate. The cashew's answer was to make its shell toxic. This worked well against most animals. It worked less well against one species that discovered at some point, several thousand years ago, that fire could destroy the toxin and leave the nut edible. The Tupi of northeastern Brazil had worked with cashew trees for millennia before any European arrived. They had discovered, through accumulated experience, what fire did to the cashew shell. They toasted the nuts in open flames, which burned off the CNSL and left the nut accessible. They consumed the nut. But it was not the part of the cashew they valued most. What the Tupi valued was the cashew apple, the swollen, fleshy stem from which the nut hung. The apple is intensely flavored, something vaguely mango-like, slightly citric, and entirely its own. It ferments naturally and rapidly. The Tupi pressed it for juice and fermented the juice into an alcoholic drink for ceremonies and daily life. The nut was secondary, a useful byproduct of a tree they grew primarily for its fruit. The Tupi called the tree and its fruit acaju. This name is the origin of every word for cashew in every European language. The Portuguese took it as caju. The French turned it into cashew. The English garbled it into cashew. The Germans borrowed cashew and added their word for nut, cashewnus. 5 centuries of trade and colonization, and the plant still carries the name the Tupi gave it. The language changed, the name did not. The first European to describe the cashew in writing was the French Huguenot Jean de Lery, who spent nearly a year in Brazil between 1557 and 1558. De Lery described the cashew apple with the enthusiasm of someone tasting something genuinely new. He was less enthusiastic about the nut's shell, which he identified correctly as something to be avoided. Gabriel Soares de Souza, writing in 1587, warned that the shell's resin blistered skin with the efficiency of the worst caustics known to colonial medicine. Both men understood the cashew primarily as a fruit tree. The nut was interesting, but secondary. This was still, in the late 16th century, the Tupi perspective on the cashew. The European reversal of that hierarchy, making the nut the primary product and the fruit a local curiosity, came later. It came with colonialism. The Portuguese established Goa as their primary base on the Indian subcontinent in 1510, when Afonso de Albuquerque led the forces that took the city from the Bijapur Sultanate. Goa sat on the Malabar coast. The land around the coastal settlements was sandy, laterite-heavy, and largely unsuitable for the rice and grain cultivation that the growing colonial population needed. Soil erosion on the coastal slopes was a persistent problem. The Portuguese needed something that would grow in poor soil without intensive cultivation. Around 1560, the cashew tree arrived in Goa. The Portuguese brought it from Brazil, recognizing that the same qualities useful in the semi-arid Ceará, deep roots, tolerance for thin soil, no irrigation needed, would apply to Goa's coastal terrain. The tree was planted not primarily as a food source, it was planted as a soil stabilizer. The agricultural logic was sound. The cashew tree's root system prevented erosion on slopes that the monsoon would otherwise strip bare. Its canopy provided shade without consuming the water table the way shallow-rooted trees did. The cashew apple could be consumed locally. The nut was a bonus. Within decades, cashew trees were growing across the coastal terrain of Goa in sufficient numbers to define the landscape. What the Portuguese did not anticipate was what Goans would make of the cashew apple. Fermenting and distilling the juice of the cashew apple, Goans produced a spirit they called feni. The word may derive from the Sanskrit fena, meaning froth or foam. Feni became amma and remains oma, the most distinctive alcoholic product of Goa. It has a protected geographical indication. It is distilled in traditional clay pots called bati. Its flavor is intense, fruity, and unmistakable. People who encounter feni for the first time rarely have a moderate reaction. They either find it extraordinary or overwhelming. There is no middle ground. The origin of feni in the Portuguese introduction of the cashew tree to Goa in the 16th century is known to historians, but not to most people who drink feni. In contemporary Goa, feni is an emblem of local identity, defended with the same pride that Scots defend whiskey or Mexicans defend tequila. That its raw material comes from a tree imported from Brazil 5 centuries ago is considered, by those who know it, an interesting footnote. It is not considered a complication. This capacity for the cashew to become native wherever it arrives is one of the constants of its history. The same process happened in Mozambique and Tanzania, where Portuguese colonial administrators planted cashew trees along the Indian Ocean coast in the 17th and 18th centuries. The sandy coastal soils of East Africa suited the cashew as well as those of Goa. The trees flourished. Within generations, they were considered part of the indigenous landscape. The colonial origin was absorbed into local identity. The nut that grew on the outside of the cashew apple had to be processed before it could be eaten. Processing it meant dealing with the CNSL. Every technique for doing so involved either burning the oil away or protecting the worker from contact with it. Neither was simple. Neither was cheap in terms of human cost. The most basic technique was roasting in open fire. The nut in its shell was placed directly over burning coals or in a drum over flames. The heat burned away the CNSL. The problem was the smoke. CNSL burned in open air produces fumes that are toxic to breathe. Workers who toasted cashews in open fires developed respiratory damage that was documented, reported, and largely ignored by colonial administrators. The second technique, developed progressively through the 19th and 20th centuries, was mechanical cracking. A worker used a mallet or lever to crack the shell at a specific point, releasing the nut without, ideally, spraying CNSL. The cashew shell is not uniform. Its curve and varying thickness made mechanical cracking unpredictable. Sometimes the tool struck correctly and the nut emerged intact and dry. Sometimes the shell cracked at the wrong point and CNSL sprayed onto the worker's hands, face, or into the surrounding air. The women of Kerala, who dominated cashew processing from the late 19th century, developed calloused hands that offered partial protection against the CNSL. Years of repeated exposure produced a degree of chemical adaptation. This adaptation came at a cost. Persistent skin damage, scarring, and, in some cases, chronic dermatitis were recognized occupational hazards. The women who worked in cashew factories knew this. They worked anyway. The industry provided employment in a region where alternatives were limited.
Kerala became the global center of cashew processing for reasons that had nothing to do with the cashew tree, which does not grow naturally in the region. It happened because the Malabar coast had cheap labor. The port of Kollam was well positioned for shipments from Brazil and East Africa, and processing knowledge had accumulated in the region over several generations. The cashew came from 3 continents. The processing happened in one city on the southwest coast of India. The finished product went to Europe and America. The cashew apple's invisibility in global markets is one of the stranger outcomes of the cashew's commercial history. The apple is the majority product of the cashew tree. For every pound of nut, the tree produces between 6 and 12 pounds of apple. If the cashew were a normal fruit, the apple would be the thing people traveled to Brazil to taste. The nut would be considered a processing byproduct. The apple is not a normal fruit in the commercial sense. It spoils within 48 to 72 hours of harvest. It bruises at a touch. It cannot survive intercontinental shipping at any temperature achievable with conventional refrigeration technology of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The apple stayed in Brazil because it had no choice. The nut, dried and processed, could cross oceans. The apple could not. In northeastern Brazil, the cashew apple, cashew, is a staple. The juice is sold in every supermarket. Cajuína, a clarified and pasteurized version produced especially in Piauí, has a geographic indication of its own. The flavor is so tied to northeastern Brazilian identity that describing it in the abstract is nearly impossible. It tastes like something that has no equivalent anywhere else. This is in part because it has no equivalent anywhere else. The cashew apple is one of a kind in flavor, as in botany. The tourists who arrive in Ceará or Piauí and try cashew apple juice for the first time rarely forget it. The flavor is dense, slightly acidic, intensely fruity, and leaves the tongue with a faint astringency that comes from tannins in the apple flesh. It is nothing like the cashew nut. They come from the same tree, but they share almost no sensory properties. The nut is mild, rich, and buttery. The apple is loud, acidic, and immediate. The world outside Brazil does not know the apple. The world outside Brazil knows only the nut. This asymmetry is a direct product
of the cashew's commercial history. What could travel, traveled. What could not, stayed behind. The label on a bag of cashews in a grocery store has not changed significantly in decades. It says cashews. It might say roasted and salted, or unsalted, or natural. Some bags say raw cashews. All of these labels share one characteristic. They omit the most interesting fact about the product inside. No cashew sold commercially anywhere in the world is truly raw. The nut cannot reach a consumer in an unprocessed state. The CNSL in its shell makes any form of direct consumption toxic. Before the cashew reaches a human mouth, the CNSL must be neutralized by heat. The cashew nut is roasted directly, steam processed, or treated with high-temperature oil to destroy the toxic compounds. The raw cashews sold in health food stores have been steam processed and dried. The steam destroys the CNSL. The subsequent drying produces a product that looks unroasted but has been subjected to significant heat. It is not raw. It has never been raw. This is not a regulatory failure. It is a structural impossibility. A truly raw cashew nut, one that has come directly from the shell without any heat treatment, would cause burning in the mouth and throat of anyone who ate it. The heat step is not optional. It is the entire premise of the cashew as a food product. Without it, the cashew is not food. It is a chemical hazard. The label says raw because consumers associate raw with natural, and natural with healthy, and healthy with a price premium. The cashew industry discovered this long ago and has seen no compelling reason to correct the impression. The fact that the nut has been through a factory, through steam, through sorting and inspection and packaging before reaching the shelf, none of this appears on the bag. The bag says cashews. The history of every step between the tree and the bag is, in the commerce of the cashew, considered irrelevant. The CNSL that is removed from cashew shells during processing does not disappear. It goes somewhere. For most of the early history of cashew processing, it went onto the floor, into the air, and onto the workers. As the industry developed, chemists and engineers recognized that CNSL had commercial properties that made it valuable far beyond the cashew nut industry. CNSL is rich in anacardic acid, cardinol, and cardol. These compounds have exceptional thermal stability and resistance to mechanical wear. Cardinol, in particular, when polymerized and formulated, produces resins and coatings that withstand high temperatures and friction without degrading. This made it useful in industrial applications that required materials to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary polymers. Automobile brake pads require friction materials that can withstand repeated high-temperature cycles without breaking down. The pad must grip the rotor firmly enough to stop the vehicle, then release cleanly, then grip again
cycle after cycle, in temperatures that can exceed several hundred degrees Celsius under hard braking. CNSL-derived resins became a standard component in brake pad formulations. They provided the heat resistance and friction characteristics that synthetic alternatives had difficulty matching at comparable cost. The connection between a bag of cashews and an automobile's braking system is not obvious.
It exists nonetheless. The oil from those shells, the oil that burned the hands of the women who cracked them, is a component in one of the most safety-critical systems in road transport. The cashew's industrial and culinary histories are not separate. They are the same tree. During the Second World War, when Japanese forces occupied the rubber-producing territories of Southeast Asia, Allied industries faced acute shortages of natural rubber. Researchers in India and Britain investigated CNSL as a partial substitute in some rubber applications. The cashew processing industry in Kerala, already significant by the 1940s, received a new category of industrial demand on top of the food processing business. The shell liquid that had been a hazardous waste product became a strategic material. The anacardic acid that gives the cashew tree its genus name has properties that researchers began investigating systematically in the second half of the 20th century. The first significant findings concerned the bacterium Streptococcus mutans, the primary bacterial cause of dental cavities. Anacardic acid inhibited S. mutans growth in laboratory conditions at concentrations comparable to conventional antibiotics. The compound crossed the cell membrane of the bacterium and disrupted its metabolic processes. This discovery had an obvious irony attached to it. The compound responsible for the burns on the hands of cashew processing workers was, in controlled dilution, effective against one of the most common human bacterial infections. The thing that the industry had spent decades trying to neutralize safely was a potential antibiotic. Later research extended the picture. Anacardic acid showed activity against Staphylococcus aureus, including methicillin-resistant strains, and inhibitory effects against Helicobacter pylori. It demonstrated anti-inflammatory properties in cellular models. None of these findings had produced an approved pharmaceutical within the period covered by this history. The distance between laboratory results and a drug on the pharmacy shelf is long, expensive, and uncertain. But the direction of the research was clear. The poison contained medicine. The evolutionary logic behind this is straightforward. Anacardic acid evolved as a defense against organisms that threatened the seed. Insects, fungi, bacteria, small mammals. The CNSL deterred or killed organisms that would have consumed or damaged the nut before it could germinate. The same mechanisms that made it dangerous to the bacteria threatening a seed made it dangerous to bacteria threatening a human. Evolution produced a defense system. Pharmacology looked at that defense system and saw a tool. Guinea-Bissau is one of the smallest nations on the African continent. For a significant portion of the late 20th century, cashew nuts accounted for more than 80% of the country's export earnings. The cashew trees in Guinea-Bissau descend from plants Portuguese administrators introduced in the 17th and 18th centuries, using the same rationale as Goa: sandy soils unsuitable for other crops, minimal maintenance,
reliable production. The structural problem with an economy that depends on one export commodity for 80% of its foreign exchange is simple to state and difficult to solve. When the world price of that commodity rises, the country prospers. When the price falls, the country contracts with equal force and speed. The producers of cashews in Guinea-Bissau, smallholder farmers managing trees they cannot afford to replace or significantly improve, do not set the price. The price is set in commodity markets in cities they have never visited, by buyers whose identities and motivations are unknown to them. This structure is not unique to Guinea-Bissau or to cashews. It is the standard condition of commodity-dependent economies throughout the post-colonial world. What makes the cashew a particularly instructive example is that the tree producing the commodity was introduced by the same colonial power whose trading relationships created the dependency. The Portuguese planted the trees. The Portuguese and the commercial networks that followed them organized the trade. When the colonial period ended, Guinea-Bissau kept the trees and inherited the dependency. The parallel with Ireland and the potato in the 19th century is not precise, but it is instructive. In both cases, a crop was adopted as the primary productive activity of a population that had limited alternatives. In both cases, the dependency on that single crop created a vulnerability that the structure of the economy could not absorb when conditions changed. The Irish potato famine was biological. A pathogen destroyed the crop. The cashew economy's vulnerability is financial. Price movements outside the country's control determine whether the same crop produces prosperity or hardship. The tree is the same. The economic exposure is structurally similar. The cashew tree growing in Ceará today is botanically identical to the cashew tree that grew in Ceará 3,000 years ago. The nut grows on the outside. The shell contains CNSL. The apple spoils within days. The roots go deep to reach water. The tree does well in poor soil and tolerates drought. None of that has changed. What changed was everything around the tree. The Tupi who first cultivated it valued the apple and toasted the nut over fire. The Portuguese took the tree to 3 other continents and inadvertently created an industry. That industry depended on the labor of women whose hands it damaged. The CNSL those women processed ended up in brake pads. The nut that went through their hands ended up labeled raw. In grocery stores, it never was. The anacardic acid in the shell turned out to have antibiotic properties. The apple that nobody outside Brazil could eat because it spoiled too fast turned out to be, by all accounts, extraordinary. The nut itself, mild, buttery, versatile, became one of the most consumed nuts in the world precisely because it had almost no flavor that could offend anyone. It was the nut for people who did not have strong opinions about nuts. The woman in the Kolam warehouse in 1952 is not on the cashew package. The fire that destroyed the CNSL is not on the cashew package. The ship that brought the nut from Mozambique to Kolam is not on the cashew package. The brake pad that contains the oil from the shell is not on the cashew package. The package says cashews.
The history says considerably more.
The cashew tree arrived in East Africa before it arrived in the general awareness of the European naturalists, who would eventually classify and describe it. Portuguese trading ships moving along the East African coast between Mozambique and the Indian Ocean trade routes carried cashew seedlings and seeds in the 17th and 18th centuries. The trees took hold in the coastal soils of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya with the same ease they had shown in Goa. The sandy, laterite-heavy terrain of the East African coast was precisely the environment in which the cashew had evolved to excel. By the 19th century, East Africa was producing significant quantities of cashew nuts. Mozambique, in particular, developed substantial cashew cultivation along its northern coast, in the provinces of Cabo Delgado and Nampula. The climate there, warm, with seasonal rainfall and long dry periods, was close enough to northeastern Brazil that the trees produced reliably. The Portuguese colonial administration encouraged cultivation without offering the producers much stake in the profits that the nuts generated downstream. The processing of East African cashews followed the same geography as Brazilian nuts. The unshelled cashews were loaded onto ships in Mozambican ports and carried to Kollam and other processing centers on the Malabar coast of India. The separation between where the nut grew and where it was processed was not geography. It was a colonial trade structure that positioned India as the labor source for a product grown in Africa and consumed in Europe. When Mozambique gained independence from Portugal in 1975, the new government made a decision that seemed rational from an economic development perspective. Instead of exporting raw cashews to India, Mozambique would build its own processing industry. The government built processing facilities, passed regulations requiring a minimum percentage of cashews to be processed domestically before export, invested in training workers. The results were complicated. The processing facilities built in Mozambique in the late 1970s and 1980s were not always equipped with the most efficient technology. The quality of processed nuts was variable. Indian processors, with generations of accumulated knowledge and established relationships with European and American buyers, remained competitive even as Mozambican processing capacity grew. By the 1990s, the cashew processing industry in Mozambique was struggling in ways that the industry in Kerala was not. The structural advantage that India had built through a century of specialization was not easily replicated by a newly independent government in the span of a decade. Vietnam entered the picture in the late 20th century and changed it definitively. Vietnam grew its own cashews in the southern provinces. Vietnamese processors combined industrial expertise, government investment, and labor costs competitive with India's. By the early 21st century, Vietnam had become the world's largest processor of cashews, processing both Vietnamese nuts and raw nuts imported from Africa and Brazil. The geography of cashew processing shifted eastward again, following the economics. The woman in the Kollam warehouse in 1952 had counterparts in Mozambique in the 1980s and in Vietnam at the turn of the millennium. The work was similar in its essentials: open shells, extract nut, protect hands as best as possible. The industrial context differed. The shells were the same. The cashew nut's nutritional profile explains part of why it became so dominant in the global snack market. The nut is rich in monounsaturated fats, the same category as olive oil, along with magnesium, zinc, iron, and copper. A small handful provides meaningful quantities of nutrients that many people in industrialized countries do not get in sufficient quantities from their regular diets. The combination of flavor and nutrition made the cashew attractive to the health food market that expanded from the 1970s onward. The flavor is not aggressive. This is important. The cashew nut is mild, slightly sweet, with a buttery richness that does not compete with other flavors. It works in savory dishes and sweet preparations. It works plain or roasted. It works ground into nut butter. It works chopped into salads or stirred into sauces. This versatility made the cashew the default nut in cuisines with no historical relationship with the plant, because it integrated without resistance into almost any preparation. The price of cashews reflects the complexity of their processing. Cashews are consistently among the most expensive commercial nuts per pound. Almonds, peanuts, and walnuts are cheaper in most markets. The reason is the processing requirement. Separating the nut from the CNSL laden shell is more labor-intensive than shelling most other nuts. A walnut shell is hard, but chemically inert. You can crack it and eat what's inside. A cashew shell requires either heat treatment to neutralize the toxin or careful mechanical cracking to avoid spraying the oil. This extra step costs money. That cost is passed to the consumer. The irony is that the premium price of cashews is often interpreted by consumers as a signal of special nutritional value or superior quality relative to cheaper nuts. The premium is actually a premium on processing difficulty, on the labor of solving a chemical problem that the nut creates. The most expensive part of a bag of cashews is the work done to make the nut safe. But that work is invisible at the point of sale. The bag says premium. It does not say why. The Tupi people of northeastern Brazil were not the only indigenous group in the Americas to have a sophisticated relationship with the cashew tree. In the Caribbean, indigenous populations encountered the cashew through the expansion of Tupi knowledge and possibly through the tree's own dispersal by birds and other animals. The Spanish and Portuguese who explored the Caribbean found cashew trees on several islands and noted that indigenous populations used both the apple and the nut. Christopher Columbus did not encounter cashew trees on his first voyage in 1492. His route through the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola kept him away from the areas where cashew trees were most prevalent. Later Spanish expeditions to the South American mainland found cashews along the northeastern coast of what is now Venezuela and Colombia, where the tree grew at the edge of its natural range. The Spanish term for cashew, marañón, which is still used in Central America, Mexico, and parts of South America, may derive from a word used by Caribbean indigenous people, though the etymology is debated. The Portuguese terms caju for the fruit, cajueiro for the tree, remain the basis for the words used in most languages. The English word cashew is the French cachou, filtered through the English pronunciation of the mid-17th century, when the nut began appearing in English markets imported through Portuguese trading channels. The first recorded use of cashew in English dates to 1599 in a travel account of the Portuguese territories in Brazil. The word carried with it the nut's reputation for being challenging to obtain. Early English accounts of cashews noted the danger of the shell. The naturalist John Gerard, writing in his Herbal of 1597, described the cashew as a tree whose shell contained an oil that burned like fire. Gerard had not seen the tree himself. He was working from travelers' reports, but his description of the CNSL's effects was accurate. The danger was part of the cashew's identity from the moment it entered European consciousness. The cashew's transformation from obscure tropical curiosity to global commodity happened across several centuries. The first stage was the Portuguese distribution of the tree across their colonial territories in Asia and Africa. The second stage was the development of processing knowledge in India. The third stage was the mechanization, partial and imperfect, of processing in the 20th century. The fourth stage was the development of global consumer markets for nuts as snack foods. The snack nut industry in its modern form is largely a 20th century creation. Peanuts, native to South America and introduced to North America through the slave trade, became the dominant salted snack nut in the United States by the early 20th century. Almonds, grown primarily in California and Spain, developed a significant market as both a cooking ingredient and a snack. Cashews occupied a different position, more expensive, less familiar, associated in the American market with higher-end snacking. The rise of cocktail culture in the United States in the mid-20th century helped establish cashews as a premium snack. Cashews appeared in cocktail dishes at the kind of social events that served them as signals of the host's taste and means. This association with aspiration was useful for a product whose processing costs made it more expensive than peanuts. The cashew was not trying to compete with peanuts. It was occupying a different register of the market. By the second half of the 20th century, the cashew had found its place. It was the nut for people who wanted something that felt sophisticated but not challenging. The flavor was rich enough to be satisfying and mild enough to never be divisive. The price was high enough to signal quality and accessible enough not to exclude the middle class. The cashew was neither exotic nor ordinary. It occupied the space between, which turned out to be exactly where the largest market was. There is something instructive about the persistence of ignorance regarding the cashew's chemistry among the millions of people who eat it regularly. The fact that the nut cannot be purchased raw, that the raw label is a processing fiction, is not hidden information. It appears in botanical descriptions, in food science literature, in the documentation of the processing industry. The industry has no interest in making it prominent, and consumers have not found it necessary to their enjoyment of the nut. This is a common feature of commodity foods. The consumer relationship with a food product is almost never a relationship with the full history of that product. It is a relationship with the product at the moment of purchase and consumption. The nut in the bag, clean and white and curved. The label that says what the marketing department wants it to say. The price that signals quality without explaining its composition. The cashew is unusual only in the degree to which the gap between the product at sale and the product at origin is both large and specific. The cashew traveled through a chemical process that was dangerous to the people who performed it. That is not the same as simply traveling far. That process is invisible at the point of sale, in a way that the travel itself, also invisible, is at least structurally unsurprising. All imported foods have traveled. Not all imported foods have passed through hands that the CNSL burned. The Tupi called it acayu. The Latin name describes a nut that grows outside the fruit. The CNSL is chemically related to poison ivy. The apple becomes feni in Goa and cayuina in Piauí. The anacardic acid kills the bacterium that causes cavities. The shell oil strengthens brake pads. The workers who made the nut safe carried the scars on their hands. All of this is the cashew. The bag in the supermarket contains all of it. The label mentions none of it. The cashew's relationship with fire predates its relationship with any industrial process. The Tupi discovered, through observation, through accident, through the accumulated trial and error of generations, that the nut inside the shell was edible if the shell had been exposed to flame first. They did not know why fire worked. They knew that it did. This empirical knowledge passed through communities without writing or scientific vocabulary. Portuguese colonizers learned it from the Tupi. Indian processors in Kerala refined it over centuries. The modern food industry encoded it in standard operating procedures. The transmission of this knowledge across cultures and centuries is less dramatic than the histories of most industrial innovations because it involves no single inventor, no moment of patent application, no claim of discovery. The Tupi did not patent toasted cashews. The Portuguese did not document their borrowing of the technique. The women of Kerala, who refined the mechanical processing of cashew shells over generations, did not write papers. The knowledge moved through practice, not through text. It survived because it was useful, and it was useful because the cashew, despite its problematic shell, turned out to be genuinely worth the trouble. The worth of the cashew is almost entirely contained in the nut. The CNSL in the shell is industrially useful, and the anacardic acid has pharmaceutical potential. But the reason the cashew tree was planted across 3 continents was the nut, and, secondarily, the apple. The nut is nutritionally dense, flavorful in a mild and versatile way, and shelf-stable in its processed form. These qualities made it valuable wherever it arrived. The apple is extraordinary, but perishable. The nut is good enough and durable. The global market chose the nut. The choice was not made consciously by any single actor. It was made by the accumulated decisions of traders, shippers, consumers, and processors across several centuries. Each decision was rational at its scale. The trader who loaded cashew nuts rather than cashew apples was making the obviously correct choice. The nut would survive the voyage.
the apple would not. The processor, who developed better techniques for cracking shells, was solving a real problem for a real market. The consumer, who bought roasted cashews at a premium price, was purchasing a genuinely satisfying product.
The accumulation of these rational decisions produced the world in which the cashew is one of the most consumed nuts globally, and the cashew apple is unknown outside its country of origin. The people who did not get to make choices in this history are the ones whose traces are hardest to find in the historical record. The Tupi farmers who first cultivated the cashew in the semi-arid interior of Ceará, the East African smallholders whose trees produced nuts that crossed the Indian Ocean to be processed in Kolam, the women in the Kolam factories who cracked shells and absorbed CNSL until their hands built the tolerance that the processing required, the Guinea-Bissau farmers whose 80% dependence on cashew export prices left their household incomes vulnerable to commodity market fluctuations they had no power to influence. These people are not on the cashew package. Their contributions to the product, cultivation, processing, the accumulated knowledge of safe handling are embedded in the nut without being credited in it. The nut carries the product of their labor to consumers who have no particular reason to think about them because the packaging provides no particular reason to do so. This is not unique to cashews. It is the condition of commodity foods distributed across global supply chains. What makes the cashew a particularly instructive case is the visibility of the gap. The chemical fact that the nut arrives pre-processed, that the raw label is fiction, is provable, specific, and directly connected to the question of whose labor did the processing. Knowing that the cashew cannot be truly raw points immediately to the question of what was done to it, and by whom, and under what conditions. Most food products do not provide this entry point so clearly. The cashew does, because its chemistry is unusual enough to make the processing step unavoidable. The nut that grows outside the fruit, in the exposed position, defended by a poison related to ivy, this nut requires a human intervention to become edible that most nuts do not. That intervention has a history. The history has people in it. The package says cashews. The cashews have a history. The history has the chemical burns and the ships and the Tupi farmers and the phenai and the brake pads and the anacardic acid. The package does not mention any of this, but it is all there in the bag, inseparably, in every